Kimi K3 gives you a 1 million token context window. That sounds like the coding agent problem is solved. Just paste the repo in. Let the model read everything. Stop worrying about what fits. Except that is exactly the trap. Because a giant context window does not make an agent smarter by itself. It makes the agent more confident with more stale evidence. Kimi K3 is a 2.8 trillion parameter open weight model. It activates about 104 billion parameters per token. It has native image input. It has a 1 million token window, and it is clearly built for long coding sessions, tool use, and big messy work. That is the exciting part. But the dangerous part is this. Developers are going to treat Kimi K3 like a bigger clipboard. They will throw in the entire repository, every failed attempt, every test log, every old plan, every irrelevant file, and then blame the model when the final diff gets weird. Kimi K3 does not remove context management. It makes context management matter more, because when your model can read almost everything, the new problem is deciding what deserves to be believed. Hey, don't forget to like and subscribe for more like this. Now, back to the video. The headline number is absurd in the best possible way. 2.8 trillion total parameters. 896 experts, 16 selected per token. 104 billion active parameters per token. 1,048,576 tokens of context. That is not a normal model release. That is moonshot saying open weight AI is not just chasing chat quality anymore. It is chasing the entire coding agent workload. The model card talks about long horizon coding, massive repositories, terminal tools, knowledge work, and native vision. That matters because coding agents do not live inside cute prompts. They live inside half-broken repos. They raid logs, they open files, they miss one tiny config option. They run a test, they edit the wrong function, they try again. That is the real workload, and Kimi K3 is aimed straight at that. Not just answer this question, not just write a React component, but stay in the job long enough to fix something with dependencies. History, screenshots, tests, and weird project rules. So yes, K3 is a big deal, but the reason it is a big deal is not just the parameter count. The real reason is that it gives developers a new temptation. For years, context was the wall. You had to choose this file or that file, this error log or the design doc, this dependency tree or the test output. The tool felt blind because the window was small. Now, Kimi K3 changes the feeling. The window is so large that you start to believe selection no longer matters, and that is where the mistakes begin. The simplest way to misunderstand Kimi K3 is to think 1 million tokens means 1 million useful tokens. Those are not the same thing. A codebase is not a book. A book usually has an order. A codebase has layers of old decisions. There are deleted features still visible in comments. There are test helpers that look like production logic. There are migration files that describe a database as it used to be. There are generated files. There are vendored files. There are stale docs. There are scripts nobody runs anymore. There are names that survived 3 rewrites and now mean the opposite of what they sound like. If you paste all of that into a model, you have not given it clarity. You have given it a room full of witnesses who disagree. The model still has to decide which witness is current. That is hard. And if your agent harness does not help it decide, the big context window becomes a very expensive rumor machine. This is the part people miss. Small context can fail because the model did not see the right file. Huge context can fail because the model saw the right file. The wrong file, the old file, the generated file, and the failed patch from 10 minutes ago. Then it blends them, and because it saw so much, the answer sounds better. That is worse. A confident wrong agent is more expensive than a confused one. At least the confused one makes you check. Kimi K3 forces a better question than can it fit. The question is, should it fit? A 1 million token window can hold a ridiculous amount of code and text, but your agent still needs a reason to include each part. A failing test log belongs in context if the agent is working on that failure. It becomes noise after the failure is changed. A design doc belongs in context if it describes the current contract. It becomes dangerous if the implementation moved on. A previous failed attempt belongs in context if it explains what not to repeat. It becomes poison if the model treats it like a half-finished solution. That is the Kimi K3 lesson for coding. Context is not storage. Context is evidence, and evidence needs labels. Current, old, observed, assumed, failed, verified. If a coding agent cannot mark those differences, a bigger window just lets it carry more unmarked evidence. That is why I do not think K3 kills retrieval. It makes retrieval more important, not because the model cannot hold the text, because the agent needs to know why the text is there. The retrieval layer is not only a way to squeeze files into a tiny window, it is a ranking system. It says, this is the active error, this is the file that owns it, this is the nearest test, this is the current API boundary, this is a previous attempt that failed. That structure still matters when the context window is huge. Maybe it matters more. The second trap is local AI mythology. Kimi K3 is open weight. That means the weights are published. You can inspect them, you can deploy them, you can build around them. That is important. It gives teams control they do not get from a closed model API. But open weight does not mean your gaming laptop just became a frontier coding appliance. This thing is enormous. The Hugging Face card lists a 2.8 trillion parameter model. The model files are not a tiny download. The shipped model uses quantization-aware training with MXFP4 weights and MXFP8 activations. That helps. It does not turn K3 into a casual local install for most developers. So when somebody says Kimi K3 is free, ask which part is free. The weights are available. The local infrastructure is not free. The electricity is not free. The memory is not free. The time spent debugging serving is not free. And the hosted API is very much priced. The useful conclusion is not that K3 is fake open. That is too lazy. The useful conclusion is that open weights move power from the model vendor into the deployment layer. If you're a serious team, that matters. You can choose a certified provider. You can self-host if your infrastructure makes sense. You can test the model in your own harness. You can compare results without waiting for a closed lab to expose every detail. But for one developer with one machine, K3 is probably not a free local cloud replacement. It is more like a frontier class component that other tools and providers can now compete to serve. That is still a big shift. It is just not the fantasy version. The pricing tells you what K3 is really for. The common API price is $3 per million input tokens and $15 per million output tokens. Cached input can be much cheaper, around 30 cents per million tokens when the cache hits. That pricing shape is a clue. It says repeated context is the target. Long coding sessions repeat a lot of context. The system prompt repeats, the repository summary repeats, the same core files repeat, the same project instructions repeat. If the cache works, a big window becomes less terrifying, but output is still the expensive side that matters for agents, because agents love to talk. They explain, they reason, they produce plans, they produce diffs, they produce logs, they produce retry summaries, and with a reasoning model, some of that output may include thinking tokens or reasoning content depending on the API. So the cost question is not just how much code can I paste in, it is how many turns does the agent need before the diff is accepted. That is the metric accepted diff per dollar, accepted diff per minute, accepted diff per human review. Kimi K3 is interesting if it improves those numbers, not if it produces a beautiful first answer that still needs 5 rounds of rescue. This is where the huge window has to earn its keep. If 1 million tokens prevents the agent from repeatedly asking for missing context, great. If it lets the agent carry a stable repo map through the whole job, great. If it reduces file opening churn and lowers failed edits, great. But if it just encourages the tool to keep everything forever, the bill can go up while the quality goes sideways. The window is a capability. The harness decides whether it becomes efficiency. Benchmarks make Kimi K3 look serious. Moonshot reports strong scores across coding and agentic tasks. Deep Suite is in the high 60s. Terminal Bench is around the high 80s. Frontier Suite is above 80 in Moonshot's table. Suite Marathon is much higher than older open models, and the model is not only code, it has strong vision and document numbers too. That matters because modern coding is increasingly visual. Front-end agents need screenshots, bug reports include images, design tasks include mocked interfaces, browser automation produces states. The model needs to understand Kimi K3 being native multimodal is not a side feature. It is part of the agent story, but benchmarks do not remove the harness problem. Look at the footnotes on these model releases, and you see the truth immediately. Different models are evaluated with different coding harnesses, different tools, different fallbacks, different settings, different access to terminals, different rules about retries. That is not cheating by itself. That is just what agent benchmarking is now. The model and the scaffold are tangled together. So if K3 scores well in one harness, your takeaway should not be that every editor plugin will magically get that score. Your takeaway should be that K3 is capable enough to deserve a real trial in your own workflow. That trial should include the boring parts. Does it edit the correct files? Does it respect project instructions? Does it notice when tests change from red to a different red? Does it stop after the fix instead of refactoring the room? Does it preserve the reasoning trail enough for a human to review? Those are not as glamorous as a leaderboard. They are the things that decide whether developers keep using it. The 1 million token window is most useful when the agent has memory discipline. That sounds backwards. Why need discipline when there's so much room? Because long context creates a new kind of failure. The agent can keep old beliefs alive too long. Imagine a coding agent starts with a wrong theory. It thinks the bug is in the database layer. It opens the database layer, it writes a note, it tries a patch, the tests still fail. Then it discovers the bug is actually in request validation. In a small context window, some of the old theory might fall out. In a huge context window, the old theory can stay there forever. Now the model has both stories, the corrected story and the dead story. If the agent does not clearly mark the old story as dead, the model can still borrow from it later. That is how you get weird final answers. The code change is mostly right, but one sentence in the explanation comes from the old theory, or the test fix is right, but the agent leaves a database guard that no longer matters. Or it says it verified something because it remembers a previous test run, even though the latest run failed differently. That is not a small context problem. That is a long context bookkeeping problem, and Kimi K3 puts that problem right in the center. The solution is not to avoid the big window. The solution is to treat the session like a ledger. Current objective, current failing signal, files that matter, hypotheses that are alive, hypotheses that died, commands already run, results that are still valid, results made obsolete by later edits. That is what a serious K3 coding setup should maintain. Not just a giant transcript, a ledger. There's another reason K3 matters even if you never run it yourself. It changes the pressure on closed coding models. Closed models used to have a clean story. They were simply better. You paid because the gap was obvious. Open models were impressive for the price, or impressive for local use, or impressive for hobby projects, but the best coding agent path still pointed toward the closed frontier. Kimi K3 makes that story less comfortable. It does not have to beat every closed model on every task. It only has to be good enough that the expensive model has to justify each call. That is a big change. If K3 can handle repo exploration, routine patches, visual inspection, and long document work, then maybe the closed model becomes a specialist route. Use it for the hardest reasoning. Use it for final review. Use it when the open model fails. But do not use it by default for every tool turn. That is how coding agents should evolve anyway. One model for every step is simple. It is also wasteful. A serious agent stack routes work. Cheap model for cheap moves. Strong model for judgment. Long context model for evidence-heavy sessions. Vision model for screenshots. Fast model for retries. Kimi K3 is interesting because it can compete for more than one of those lanes. That gives tool builders leverage, and leverage eventually shows up as lower prices, better defaults, or more honest model routing. That is the consequence developers should care about. Not the drama of which lab is winning the week. The consequence is that every expensive coding agent call now has to defend itself. The license also deserves a calm reading. Kimi K3 is open weight under the Kimi K3 license. That license is permissive for many uses, but it is not the same as a standard open source license. The important commercial condition is aimed at model as a service businesses above $20 million of aggregate revenue over a 12-month period. There is also an attribution condition for very large commercial products with thresholds around 100 million monthly active users or $20 million in monthly revenue. Internal use is carved out use through Moonshot products or certified inference partners is carved out. So if you're a normal developer testing the model, this is not the part that should scare you. But if you're building a model platform, a coding agent company, or a product that exposes K3 as a model endpoint, you have to read the license before the benchmark table. That is the grown-up version of open weights. The weights can be available and the business terms can still matter. Both things can be true. For developers, the useful habit is simple. Do not ask, is it open as one big yes or no question. Ask 4 smaller questions. Can I download the weights? Can I run them? Can I modify them? Can I commercially expose them in the way my product needs? Kimi K3 gives strong answers to the first 3 for many users. The 4th depends on what business you're building. That distinction is not pedantry. It is the difference between a weekend experiment and a product decision. So what should a developer actually do with Kimi K3? I would not start by asking whether it replaces Claude, Codex, Gemini, Qwen, or DeepSeek. That question is too broad to be useful. Start with one job, a real job, not a toy prompt. Pick a repository with a failing test, a messy history, and enough files that context actually matters. Then run the same task through your current setup and through K3. Do not score the answer by vibes, score the session. How many tool calls, how many edits, how many wrong files opened? How many times did the agent repeat a dead assumption? How much output did it generate? How much of the final diff did you accept? How much did you delete? That is how K3 earns a place. If it reduces wandering, it matters. If it keeps a large repo map coherent, it matters. If it handles screenshots and logs in the same loop, it matters. If it turns 1 million tokens into a trash pile, it does not matter how impressive the number looks. This is also where caching becomes practical. A repo summary that stays stable can be cached. Project instructions can be cached. Common interfaces can be cached. But every failed guess should not become permanent context. That is the line. Stable evidence belongs in the long window. Live investigation belongs in the working set. Dead theories belong in the notes as dead. If your agent cannot make those distinctions, Kimi K3 will not save it. It will just give it more room to be messy. The best version of Kimi K3 is not a chatbot with a giant prompt box. It is a coding system with a strict memory policy. Before the model writes code, the harness should know the current goal. Before it opens files, it should know what evidence it is looking for. Before it calls the model again, it should separate stable context from fresh observations. Before it summarizes, it should mark what is verified and what is only inferred. Before it edits, it should know which old attempts failed. That is not glamorous, but that is where agent quality comes from. Kimi K3 gives the model side enough capacity that the weak link moves somewhere else. The weak link becomes the surrounding workflow. The file picker, the test loop, the memory ledger, the cost controls, the tool permissions, the review step. That is why I think the 1 million token number is both exciting and misleading. It is exciting because it lets a model hold a far richer picture of a project. It is misleading because the picture still needs composition. Dumping everything into context is not composition, it is hoarding. And agents that hoard context eventually confuse themselves. The winner is not going to be the tool that sends the most text to K3. The winner is going to be the tool that sends the right text, labels it clearly, reuses the stable parts, and forgets the dead parts quickly. That is the actual new skill, not prompt engineering, context accounting. There is a simple way to say the whole Kimi K3 story. The model is big enough that developers can stop blaming the window for everything. That is good news. It is also uncomfortable, because if the window is no longer the obvious limit, the blame moves to the agent design. Did the tool choose the right files? Did it keep stale context out? Did it route cheap work cheaply? Did it use the vision ability when the bug was visual? Did it keep the final diff reviewable? Did it make the cost understandable? Kimi K3 does not answer those questions by existing. It makes those questions unavoidable. That is why this release matters. Not because every developer now has free frontier AI on a laptop, not because closed models are dead, not because 1 million tokens means you never have to think about context again. It matters because open weight models are now strong enough to expose the real bottleneck. The bottleneck is no longer only intelligence, it is the system around the intelligence. If your coding agent treats Kimi K3 like a smarter autocomplete, you will get a bigger bill and a longer transcript. If it treats K3 like a reasoning engine inside a disciplined workflow, you might get something much more valuable. A coding agent that can hold the map of a real project without getting lost in its own notes. That is the promise, and that is the test. Kimi K3 gives open weights a 1 million token memory. Now the tools have to prove they know what to forget